So, hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to our third episode of this podcast series that we've been recording, us, the MUNPaleobiology group, and Discovery Geopark. This is episode 3, Before Animals, the Ediacaran World. That is how we've named it. And we're joined by Professor Duncan McIlroy. Hi, Duncan. I'm just going to let you introduce yourself.
Hi, Danny. I'm Duncan McIlroy. I'm a professor at Memorial University. Specialized at the moment in the Ediacaran biota, so some of the earliest animal-like fossils.
Right.
I lead them sorry, go on.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start with the episode. So today is going to be a very interesting episode. It's going to serve as an introduction to the Ediacaran period, basically. We're going to discuss the global context of the Ediacaran period in terms of ocean chemistry, global glaciations, etc. And what I want our listeners to do is imagine a world without fish, trees, or shells, just strange-looking, soft-bodied organisms living in moving flows. So this was the Ediacaran period. It's a very mysterious chapter in Earth's history when life was unlike anything we have seen before. And in this episode, we're just going to dive into that. We're going to talk about what made this episode so unique and why it represents a crucial turning point in evolution, and how Discovery gives us a rare glimpse into this lost world. So I hope you're ready for the first question, Duncan. So to start, can you paint a picture of what Earth was like during the Ediacaran period and how different it was from the world we actually know now?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that contribute to a different Ediacaran world. The continents, for a start, were all in the southern hemisphere. Most of our continents at the moment are in the northern hemisphere.
Right.
They were quite close together as well. They're actually in the process of separating apart from what was called a supercontinent, where all the continents were fitted together all into one big landmass. So there were small oceans in between everything, and they were just coming out of So the earliest evolution of complex life, which is mainly what we're focusing on here, came after a major glaciation event in which all of those continents, at least, and probably part of the oceans around, would have been covered in ice. So there would have been giant ice sheets, a bit like you might be able to see at Greenland or in Antarctica, that were covering all of the land masses, grinding up the rocks underneath. And then just before the evolution or the first record of complex animal life that we had, those glaciers melted. And so the continents became exposed in a way, and they would have been completely barren in the way that you might imagine, like the tundra, except there wouldn't have even been lichens and things on the land. Places where there was no erosion, you might get thin microbial crusts on the surface, but mainly it would have been very, very loose sediment. It would have been prone to being blown about by the wind, reworked by currents. And all those things are important because essentially the nutrients that we get into ocean basins come from the land in large part, at least. So things like phosphorus, which is key for animal life, it comes from the land. It comes from the weathering of volcanic rocks. And so there was an abundance of that in the Ediacaran. And particularly because what the glaciers do is they take the grains and they break them up into tiny, tiny little bits without actually weathering them. So, if you go outside and you see a rock wall and it's all got lichens and things on it, it's basically been slowly worn away, and there's chemicals that are coming out of it. But if you can imagine, instead of having like rock surfaces, that the whole of the Earth was covered in a fine powder, call it rock flour, that comes out of glaciers, then you have a really reactive outer surface of the land.
Right.
And those nutrients, all of those things would have been washed down into the oceanic basins as fuel for the fuel for the Ediacaran sort of explosion of complex life.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good introduction. So, I think we can jump to the next question. So unlike the later Cambrian explosion, the Ediacaran biota was dominated by strange soft-bodied organisms, which, I mentioned in the introduction. What were these life forms like, and how did they survive in such an alien environment?
Yeah, and it was really weird, and that's partly what appeals to me about the Ediacaran, is how strange it was. Lots of the rules that we have for the modern don't really work in the ancient, particularly once you get before the evolution of things like burrowing worms. So in the Ediacaran, there were no burrowers, so there's nothing going down into the sediment and mixing the sediment layer. So anything that gets buried is then permanently buried. It's like goes into the long part of the carbon cycle. So the sea floors would not have been being grazed by anything, so there would have been microbial mats over the large parts of the surface if they weren't smothered by sediment. And living on and in those mats would have been what we would consider quite giant organisms. And that's one of the really fun things about these earliest things, that they are so big. So some of the first macrofossils that we have, a thing called Trapezoidae from the Mistaken Point Reserve, those things were about 1.5 meters in length. They're absolutely giants. And we think that they were largely just sitting on the seafloor, absorbing nutrients from both the sediment, but also from the water column. They couldn't move around, so they weren't leaving trails on the surface. It was a very sort of passive, inert environment. What these things actually look like, we don't really know, because we have very few examples of them in 3D. So usually we just preserve the lower surface of them. But oftentimes they're actually down below the mat ground. So if you can imagine that that's the seafloor, they're actually slightly down into the mat ground. So we're fairly confident that they were interacting with the seafloor during their lives, getting nutrients from it in part, but they would have also required oxygen from the water column as well. That would have been really key.
Right. We know for sure that they had no biomineralized body parts or anything. We don't have any evidence of any structures like ours.
No, not in these earlier Ediacaran rocks. Some in the late Ediacaran rocks, places like Namibia, there are some mineralized things, but these very early biotas that we have in Newfoundland that you've been talking about, they don't have any biominerals in them. So they would have been essentially the texture of a jellyfish, something like that.
Right. So Right. So they would have been probably relatively flexible, right?
Yeah. But the fossils that we have are very consistent in form, so they have a very consistent shape when we find them. So they must have been somewhat rigid as well, in the way that the bell of a jellyfish can be quite rigid as well.
Right. Okay. So one of the most fascinating aspects of the Ediacaran is that these organisms lived in a world without predators or complex food webs. How did that affect their evolution and interactions?
Yeah, and so that's really the Discovery Geopark story, is that the early part of the succession in the geopark is just these strange jellyfish-like things that were growing along the seafloor, these giant things. And then we have a couple of fossil layers which actually have preservation of fossil muscle. And the organisms that were preserved are two things called Mamcetia manunis, which means living cup in the Beothic language, and Hootia podriformis. Hootia means devil or demon in the Beothic language as well. And so these were muscular animals. They were crown group storozoans, we call them. So they actually belong to a modern group of jellyfish relatives, and they would have undoubtedly been the first predators.
So they could move.
So they could move around. Yeah, they have muscles. They could wander around. We first thought that they were attached. That when we first discovered Hootia, we thought it was attached by a disc to the seafloor, so it would have been stuck in place. But we've since discovered that they were actually mobile. So it wasn't the disc that we thought was attached was actually just a coincidence that it was associated with the fossil.
Right. So it's just.
But yeah. So that story, that transition from sort of what's been called the Garden of Ediacaran, where there's no predation, everything's just living in perfect harmony with each other. That changes at about 560-ish million years ago, and the first evidence for that anywhere in the world is in Discovery Geopark. That's what Discovery Geopark is famous for.
Right. But yeah, I guess we could say that Hootia or Mamcetia are one of the very few species that we have evidence that they could move, like, because a lot of all the things would have been just laying flat on the seafloor, and some of them just having like an erect posture upright into the water column, but just standing still, basically. So probably
So in younger Ediacaran rocks, so in the White Sea and in Australia, you see things that could move along the seafloor. They leave little trails behind, and we we have hundreds of square meters in
Right.
Newfoundland of surface, and you don't see
Nothing like
trails.
that.
There's one exception in at Mistaken Point, where we have one surface where there's some trails which we think was of an anemone, which is very similar to Hootia and Mamsetia.
Right.
But apart from that, yeah, no, everything was kind of just living happily in place.
Right. Right. Okay, so so the next question is, Discovery Geopark is one of the best places on Earth where we can study these ancient life fossils. What makes this region so important for understanding the Ediacaran world?
Yeah, so it's that transition that we were just talking about, that transition from having these beautiful fractal-like organisms, which these giant things are fractal at least on their lower surfaces. They would have looked completely alien to us. We wouldn't know what to do with them. If you went diving and you saw one of these, you'd be like, "What on earth is that thing?" And that's really the Mistaken Point story. This early evolution of big things. And I always say in Newfoundland we say that things are on the go in terms of moving. So I always say that discovery is where life got on the go, when it started moving around, when things started interacting with each other in a slightly more complicated way instead of just growing relative to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and what were the biggest challenges for life in the Ediacaran oceans, and how did these organisms adapt to their environments?
Yeah, and the Ediacaran is a rapidly changing world, really, because all those nutrients that were in the water from the land initially, probably relatively low levels of oxygen in the water column as well, which would have been a challenge for growing more complicated animal life. Things like jellyfish don't actually have very many cells associated with them. They're just 2 layers of cells around the outside of the organism. So there's not actually very many cells there. They bulk up using fluids, essentially, in the middle part of their body. But the biggest challenge to living on the seafloor is that if you live on a seafloor that's porous, it has space in between the grains, and water can move in and out. If you lay something down on the seafloor, what happens very quickly is that the microbes living in the sediment, they take up all of the oxygen. And they start making that nasty sulfide that you smell. If you lift over a stone at the beach, you get that nasty sulfurous smell in your nose. And that sulfide is actually toxic, highly toxic. So modern organisms, even the most simple modern organisms, if they encounter hydrogen sulfide, they move.
Right.
But as we just discussed, our things couldn't do that.
They can't run away.
Yeah, they can't run away, they're stuck. And so they must have had another way of solving that. And so you could do things like you could evolve a shell, but we just discussed that they didn't evolve shells until quite late. You could make a big mucus layer on your lower surface. But
right.
The quality of preservation in the Ediacaran biotics got all these fractal shapes, beautifully preserved. There wasn't a big layer of mucus between the organism and the sediment, or else we wouldn't preserve the fossil.
The preservation would be worse.
So we thought about this a few years ago with my colleague Suzanne Dufour in biology. We were talking about this, and we put forward the hypothesis that the organisms, rather than being scared of this hydrogen sulfide, they were embracing it. So their lower surface of things like Fractifusus, for example, they're not smooth. They're not trying to decrease their surface area to volume. They're creating fractal surfaces on their lower bodies. So they're actually trying to maximize the surface, which makes no sense if they're in a toxic environment and the cells might want to get killed, might end up getting killed. So what we suggested was that they might be pumping oxygen to their lower surface in order to get rid of the hydrogen sulfide. And an interesting byproduct of doing that is that if you introduce oxygen to an environment like that, you stimulate a group of microbes called the sulfur oxidizing bacteria. And they may well have grown on the surface of the organism and provided that little bit of protection from the sulfide in the sediment. So they take the hydrogen sulfide, they oxidize it, they add oxygen to it, make it into a non-toxic form. But in doing so, they generate energy for themselves.
Right.
So they create what we call biomass. They create their own bodies, which can then be ingested, for example, by the macroorganism. So we propose that this was actually a symbiosis, one of the first symbioses between macroorganisms and microbes. So the microbes get oxygen from the macroorganism, and the macroorganism, if you like, harvests some of that biomass from its lower surface, and it also gets the detox that it needed from that hydrogen sulfide. which is a really cool way to think about them. I'm not saying that everybody believes us. It is hypothetical.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting way of solving a problem and actually getting some benefit at the same time. It makes sense to us for sure.
Right, and it's not a very crazy idea. Like there are examples of modern organisms having these kind of symbiotic relationships with bacteria. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason I approached Suzanne is that she works on some clams that live in really toxic hydrogen sulfide rich environments, places like under these salmon farms and outflow from pulp mills and things like that, thiocerids. And they do exactly the same thing. They do it within a burrow, and they can move around. They can pump water using their feet. But in essence, it's the same thing. So they grow microbes to do that detox, and then they harvest the microbes for food, which is really cool.
Right. Okay, so and many of these organisms don't really fit into our modern tree of life. Are they ancestors of today's animals, or do they represent an evolutionary dead end?
I mean, that's a very difficult thing to prove. I mean, if one of these appeared in the modern world, we would say it wasn't an animal because it doesn't meet a couple of the criteria that we've defined for being an animal. And one of those things is the ability to move.
Exactly, yeah. And probably they wouldn't fit more. Apart from that, it would probably fail to meet several criteria, I think.
Yeah. So the simplest organisms we have are the Placozoa. They look a bit like tiny little, tiny slithers of jelly beans. They have 2 layers of cells. They have high surface area. They secrete enzymes. They eat microbial mats, actually. So they're very similar in lots of regards to some of the early Ediacaran biota, except that when that hydrogen sulfide builds up underneath their bodies, they just wander off and settle down somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which our things couldn't do. So, I think if you went diving in the Ediacaran oceans, you would probably have found it very difficult to draw a line between, that's the Ediacaran biota, things like the rangiomorphs, like Fractofusus, and that's a Placozoan. You'd be like, actually, there's not a whole lot of difference between those. So I think some of it depends on what you define an animal as, and obviously, since we don't know anything more simple than a Placozoan, the ability to move is pretty key to our definitions. But whether it would have been if you've been swimming around in the Ediacaran, I couldn't tell you.
Right. Right. Okay, so why is studying the Ediacaran so important for understanding the history of life on Earth, and what does this period tell us about evolution, extinction, and the rise of complex ecosystems?
I think the origins of anything are important. If you want to understand something, you have to understand where it comes from, whatever branch of science or certainly biological sciences that you're engaged with. So understanding the origins and how these things interact with each other, what some of those stresses might have been, is absolutely key for basically setting the stage for the evolution of things like worms in the latest Ediacaran, early Cambrian. We need to know what the organisms were doing and what how that transition works, whether there is a simple gradation or whether there's a truly fundamental change that happened, some novel change. I think all of those things are interesting questions, for sure. Are they integral to understanding modern life on Earth? Probably not, because obviously we know that life has happened. But it does tell us that life adapted to a lot of changes very rapidly during the Ediacaran. So the evolution of the first predators, the evolution of organisms that were capable of moving through sediment and grazing on mat grounds, which were then also the food for these very earliest organisms. All those pressures tell us what might have happened in order to switch the balance, if you like, from things like the Rangiomorpha, the Arboriomorpha that you've discussed in your other episodes, to more modern organisms like the Staurozoa that we see in Discovery Geopark. You can go offshore Newfoundland here and swim about in the kelp beds, and you can see Staurozoans. Those are very, very fundamental body plans that evolved very early on, in concert with and alongside some of these more novel body plans that we don't see today. So understanding like how these things interacted with each other, and how they might have changed the world to sort of engineer. We talk about ecosystem engineering. The first animals that were capable of predating, of grazing, of burrowing, fundamentally changed the world. They didn't just change ecosystems, they changed the biosphere, particularly marine biospheres, the marine biosphere. So they made a world that was no longer suitable for their ancestors, and that's one of the really interesting things about how the changes in early life have shaped the world. You know, what would have happened if animals had not evolved muscles? What would the world have been like? All those really interesting philosophical questions, are really interesting and kind of key as thought experiments for understanding changes in the modern world.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of philosophical questions I feel when you think of the Ediacaran.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of fun about it. And it's illuminated by beautiful fossils as well, which is always a nice thing for a paleontologist.
For sure, yeah. Well, thank you very much for participating, Duncan. And I think a lot of the topics that we discussed in this introduction to Ediacaran, we'll discuss them again in more detail with Helena in the next episode 4. But yeah, thank you for participating. I hope everyone enjoyed, and thank you, Duncan.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. These have been really fun.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.